All right, and welcome back. And we are now continuing our review of the book Zero to One Notes on Startup or How to Build a Company. And so far, we have done two sessions. In our first session, we reviewed the background on the authors, the context of the book, and reviewed the chapter one to set the stage. And in our second session, we talked about chapter two and chapter three. And both of these sessions have been recorded and now they are available in our YouTube channel. Today, we'll be starting with chapter four. And before I give you the introduction to chapter four and five, Aqueel, give us a context. Where did we end it last time?
Sure. So chapter 3 basically takes this contrarian idea about monopoly is good. That's what Peter Thiel's position is. So he says that a monopoly have high margins. So it produces happy customers, it produces happy employees, it leaves enough money in the business to basically go to develop new products. In general, a good business is a monopoly. And then he also talks interesting idea that those who are monopolists, they always try to hide their monopoly by saying they're not monopolists, and those who are not monopolists, they always try to promote themselves by saying they are monopolists. But at the end of the day, his position is monopoly is good, as long as it's not a kind of monopoly which basically just try to capture the value. And a monopoly is built around creating new products and making the customer happy and producing things which basically are valuable for society and they're willing to pay for it.
Right. So the chapter four talks about this concept, which he calls the ideology of competition. So, as we've discussed, that competition basically eats away the profit and gradually destroys the business and make it hard to innovate or to go from zero to one. And so you just want to try to become a little more efficient and do a little more of an incremental improvement rather than a true innovation. But at the same time, competition is the most common pattern in businesses, and it's not the monopoly. So chapter four talks about why or how or what evidence we have that there is an ideology of competition in the market and in our culture in general. And then the chapter five that we will tie up with this in our session today basically talks about what he calls lost mover advantage. But another way of looking at that chapter is basically what helps you build that monopoly, what helps you build that moat around yourself, as Warren Buffett likes to call it, that will allow you to succeed and grow enough, and that what Peter Thiel and innovators say that will help you basically finance the innovation and develop better and better products in general. Let's start with the ideology of competition. Do you want to start with this, Aqueel?
Sure. This chapter actually starts off with the idea that competition is very prevalent in the society, although it benefits nobody. So competition wastes resources and whatnot. But then why people engage into it? And he tries to answer this question. And he said that our whole society basically is designed around the idea of competition. And we get it's more like a philosophical discussion. But his main point is that even from very young age, we are encouraged to compete, and the good students in the school are the one who get good scores and who are better than other students. So basically, he actually says that.
So he's basically saying that the whole school system has been designed around competition and grades, and students win competition. They win, first positions, and then there is merit list and rank order list. And in contrast, the students who don't learn sit best by sitting still on a desk or completing assignments or somehow feel inferior. The student hasn't completed the homework, the student is failing. The every day becomes like a chore towards a certain goal, and you're being basically compared against your peer. Although I think there is some understanding in the pedagogical circles that this is not good, and some of this is slowly going away. But I think there's still a lot of this built in, and this continues all the way up to the highest level, right? So Peter Thiel talks about even his own experience as a lawyer.
Yeah, I exactly have the same experience. That is correct. We both are from a very elite medical school, so we have this experience on a personal level also. But I would like to quote some of his interesting statements. He said that The competitive student, he keeps on going until the elite student climbs to the level of competition which beats their dream out of them. So basically, people keep on climbing the chain of competition until they face a adversary where they basically just at that point they just give up.
So my
And then he
favorite
said,
quote was that all Rhodes scholars had a great future in their past.
exactly, yeah, that's another good one. That's another good one. And I actually there is a law, Danish. It's called Sayre's law. Sayre's law says that in any dispute, the intensity of feeling is inversely proportional to the value of issue at stake. So the less is the value of something, the more intense people fight about it.
Hmm.
So that,
It's
that is
called
basically
Sears
very
law.
interesting. Sayre's law, Sayres, Sayre's law, and also called
Sears
law of
law.
triviality. Law of
Hmm.
triviality. The more trivial something is, the more intense people fight about it. And there is a similar kind of law about academic circles, that some things like the fights in academic circles are very intense because stakes are too low.
Right. So,
So
Peter Thiel also tries to explain why this conflict or why this such an interest in competitiveness or competition. And he proposes that there are two models, Marxist model and Shakespeare's model, for understanding any kind of conflict. And he says Marx's model is that people fight because they're different, that they don't look alike, or they are not from the same class, or same times kind of affordability. Um, but on the opposite side, Shakespeare says that all combatants look more or less alike. And, for example, he quotes Romeo and Juliet, two households, both alike in dignity. And he says that, when they start fighting, soon they actually forget or lose track of why the conflict even started, and just continuing the conflict becomes important for them.
yeah, I think it's purely theoretical discussion. Why people fight? I mean, Marx is saying people fight because different, and Shakespeare is saying people fight because they're the same. Uh, and even maybe human beings like to fight. I mean, I can see this trait, especially in the Western civilization. People just are, they like fight. And he actually gives metaphors earlier, warlike metaphors in business, headhunters, sales force, captive market, making a killing. So it's basically not a business, it's like you're going to war. That these kind of metaphors in the war. But I think it's my personal opinion at this point that in the West, it's people are physical people. They like the ideas of war. I mean, if you watch the movies, most of them are about war. You will never see a movie without somebody dying in it. Uh, it's people.
It'll become a deeper conversation, but maybe it comes from our
Sure.
evolution where the resources were scarce, and rather
Yeah.
than innovating around the problem of scarcity, we basically fight to have ownership. And that's why there is this whole turf war concept. And this is my area, this is my. And animals do that, right? So lobsters, for example, they have their turf. You can't go into that. Gorillas have their turfs, the sea
Sure.
lions have their turfs, and
Sure.
so on and so forth. But coming back, he circles it back and brings it to the business and gives two very beautiful examples. One example of the competition between Google and Microsoft, where they started as two very separate companies. One was a search company, and the other was a software company. Well, then they started encroaching into each other. Microsoft came up with the Bing search. Google came up with the Chrome OS against Internet Explorer versus Chrome, and then they had the Google Docs versus Microsoft Office, Microsoft Surface versus Google Nexus tablet, and so on and so forth. And it actually gave advantage to the third company, which was doing its own thing, which was Apple. And it goes on to another example, but one very interesting observation he said was that he says rivalry causes us to overemphasize old opportunities and slavishly copy what has worked in the past. So one of the problem with competition, like he said in chapter 3, is that you stop innovating. You start incremental improvement. You start scaling. Okay, how can I save 5% more in keeping this, making these phones or these tablets? I can make camera from 8 pixel to 9 megapixel or 10 megapixel and so on and so forth. Instead of completely innovating and say, okay, what are pictures being used for? And how can we completely change what we do with the pictures? Once you have reached 8 or 9 or 10 megapixel, what's the point, of going to 20, 12, 13, 14, 15 megapixel? But that's one of the problem with competitiveness, rivalries, that you overemphasize old opportunities and slavishly copy what has worked in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the problem basically is that you are focusing on your competitor and not on your own business. So you're basically are your direction and your pace is set by somebody else. So that is a big problem, and of course, it's from a scarcity mindset that there's shortage of ideas or lack of creativity on the part also. Some people are very good in competing, but they're not very good in creating. So they
That's right.
basically feel that in the competitive field they can beat your opponent, but they're not very good in creating. So that
So
that
he,
might be the reason.
yeah. So the other business example he gives is about mobile credit card readers. So it used to be, I remember that time where, if someone is doing a business he comes to your home and he, for example, fixes a door. Now you want to pay him. And because he's not an established business, he's a solo practitioner or entrepreneur, you can't pay him in credit card. I remember those days when you have to have cash and you pay him in cash. And then I remember the time when first time I saw this guy who showed up, did a repair on my car at my home. And, I found him on, Facebook or Craigslist or whatever. And he actually had this square device that he plugged into his phone. And back then the phone still has those earphone ports where you plug in earphone. And he plugged in that square device into it. And, it took him like 20 minutes to set it up and log in and this and that. But he was able to then swipe my credit card and take a payment. But then what happened after that was that so many other companies jumped on it and they started making their own credit card reader. And it just became, it's just foolish. And he gives this interesting observation afterward. And he says that competition can make people hallucinate opportunities where none exist. So you start thinking,
Exactly.
oh, this must be very important. Let me start doing this
Hallucinate
too.
opportunity. I like that word a lot. Hallucinate opportunity. That's a beautiful expression. Uh, hallucination is very common in startup scene anyway. Founders hallucinate a lot. That's a good word. Uh, Also, uh, the point basically this I want to emphasize this point more. When A and B compete, C wins, and that's a very important understanding. It's a very important realization. If people understand that it's applicable not only in business environment but across the board. In military and geopolitical situations, when A and B fight, C always benefit. So in personal relationships also, when husband and wife divorce, it's always the lawyer who makes the killing. So it's a very common kind of a situation. It's a very very yeah, but that's all I
So
will say about it.
he then goes on and he basically concludes this chapter and section by discussing what's the solution. And
Hmm.
he says if you must fight, A, don't fight. B, if you must fight, then you should try to go for a killing and just destroy the other
Yeah,
person and keep your monopoly. Or C, if it is a situation where there is a good competitor and you cannot win, then if you can't beat the rival, you have to join it. Yeah, it's better to merge. And he gives his personal example that he started PayPal with another co-founder, and then soon after, Elon has started X.com, and both were trying to go after the same business of online payments for people who are selling things, for example, on eBay or other places. And soon they realize that they keep on doing things better and better, and they're making the product better, but they're killing each other. And this is unsustainable. And then both of them were worried about the internet bubble and the stock market crash of '99 that was going to happen. So they decided, they had a meeting, and they were both sane head, both Peter Thiel and Elon, and I think both of them have disclosed that they think they have Asperger trait. And he actually talks about in his book that why Asperger people are more successful because they don't follow the cultural norm. But they decided they merge their companies and just become PayPal. And imagine that Elon was willing to just give up the X.com, although he kept the domain and the name, registered name of the company. But he just, joined his old team at PayPal, and it was a 50-50 merge, which is also another interesting observation. That there wasn't this debate, I'm going to be 51% and you're going to be 49% and so on
yeah,
and so forth. But that's the solution he came up with to get over this whole competition foolhardishness.
yeah. 50% of something valuable is much better than 0%. 100% of something which is nothing,
Right.
right? 100% of zero is still zero. So that's very important, and that's why I always emphasize. Whenever we were discussing all those investment opportunities, and talking to startup founders, I always try to tell them, ask this question that why don't you just merge with your competitors? Why don't you basically find common? Why are you wasting the resources? in poor countries, the most important, valuable resource is capital. And there's A is wasting capital, B is wasting capital, C is wasting capital, 15 people are wasting capital. Why don't just all get
Right. I
together?
think we had
And
specifically in context of, for example, telehealth or telemedicine provider. We have had this discussion that it's the same doctor, it's
yeah,
the same patient. Capital is hard. We're all trying to do the same thing. Sit down on the table and just merge. Then what's the point? If a company has
yeah, just
7,000
merge.
doctors, company B has 13,000 doctors, just merge them.
Exactly. Your cost structure will decrease, your capital will be saved, duplication of effort will be gone, and a lot of CEOs who are basically spinning their wheels, they just have to sit on the sideline and just reap the profits.
Otherwise,
You don't even have to do anything.
you will give more and more payment cut to the doctors to win over the doctors, and B, you will give cheaper and cheaper fee to the patient, and that means that basically you will have nothing left for you to run the business, and you will become completely non-profitable.
Yeah, I mean, in that environment, it is especially important to preserve the capital. Capital is the bottleneck in poor countries. In US, at least there's capital is abundance of capital. People have money. They will put the money on a startup. So the waste of capital is not even an issue here. Here, the problem basically is that probably the market is become too small when there are too many competitors and nobody's making any profit. But at least the fuel to sustain the business is there. In poor countries, the capital is in short supply. The business is not going to survive. Nobody's going to infuse an unlimited amount of money into that business for an indefinite amount of time. Nobody's going to do that. So the companies are going to die. So there's another level of pressure on those companies as compared to countries like US. Here's US is a capital-rich country, so much money. People, yeah. The problem with competition here is profitability.
Right.
There, the problem is survival.
So let's transition into the next chapter, which is completely tied in with this whole theme of discussion. So he circles around and starts with this concept, from the base ground up to lead to this discussion. Okay, how then you become at that monopolistic startup that you're trying to be to succeed and really grow. And he names or labels this chapter as last mover advantage. And he starts with a very interesting observation or question. He says that, Twitter went public in 2013 and it was valued at 24 billion, which was more than 12 times the market capitalization of New York Times. So New York Times, very well established, very old company in digital and online media, print media, and so on, in publishing and books and so on. And then there's Twitter, which just people's tweet. He doesn't even, tweets are not even the employees whose job is to sit down and come up with interesting tweets or news. It's just people. It's like Wikipedia. Somebody will show up and they will put on something important. And why is it that it's 12 times more valuable than something like New York Times? And then he says the answer is cash flow. And it seems contrary on the surface, but he basically says that it's the future cash flow of a company that tells you what is the value of a company, not the past cash flow. So if a company has made $100 billion in the last 50 years, it doesn't matter anymore. The question is how much that company is going to make in the next 10 or 15 or 20 or 100 years. Of course, we don't have a way to look at 100 years. We typically answer this question at 10 or 15 years of valuation, that how much money and when will that money will come in.
Yep.
So he defines
that
the
is
value of
exactly
a
the
business.
point.
He says the value of a business is the sum of all the money it will make in the future. And then, because the money will become less effective, it will buy you less. So you want to actually discount it. So, $1 million 10 years from now may be only equal to 600,000 today, based on how much you can predict the inflation and so on and so forth. And he basically then talks about these two patterns of future revenue. Or actually there are three, but he talks about two. One is a company that has stable revenue. Every year makes about the same, and it grows only as much as inflation. So inflation adjusted is not growing. It's just making whatever it was making and continues to make whatever it's making. So the valuation is very simple. The value of the company should be 10 times the current revenue if it's going to be the same every year, or only grow as adjusted to the inflation.
Not revenue, profits.
Profits,
it will be
right,
profit.
right. Free cash flow
Earnings.
or leftover cash or free cash flow, basically.
Free cash, exactly. That's even correct. Free cash flow.
Free cash flow, the free cash that it is left over after all the expenses paid. As then, so he doesn't talk about that company, but he talks about two companies, which are basically the New York Times and Twitter. He's explaining that New York Times is valued less because the peak revenue or peak cash flow was in the past. And he expects with the changing environment of the world, unless the company pivots in some ways, the free cash flow every year generated by it will decline over time over the next 10, 15 years. In contrast to something like Twitter, the free cash flow is in the future. And that's what a startup is. A startup is that doesn't have any free cash flow right now. It may or may not even have a revenue, but it's definitely not keeping any of that cash of that revenue. It's just respending. But it's a promise of a very robust free cash flow in the future that you're somehow trying to calculate and give a value to that business on that.
Correct. So basically, startup is more valuable because it has more growth in it. So as the market is always forward looking, not the past. Market is always directed toward the future, not in the past. So market will say that, let's say this company is, let's say, making $1, but in 10 years it will be making $100, and you give a multiple of 10 and will say, well, this company's, let's say, stock price is $1,000, right? On the other hand, a company who makes, let's say, $10, and in next 10 years, let's say that we say the company will be making $20, from 10 to 20, and you attach a multiple of 10 to it, it will be $200. So just looking at the current earnings will not tell us much. The farther we go, basically, if most of the startups, they're basically their profitability years in the future. And here, an important point to remember is that in an inflationary environment, the startups suffer a lot because that future earnings become less valuable now. So when you discount it, so which is happening right now, the startups, the growth companies basically suffer a lot of inflation because when you discount the future earnings to now, its value is much smaller than it used to be when inflation was low.
I think,
So
I agree with that, and I will add to it. So, a company A is making a free cash flow of $1, saving a cash of $1. That $1 is more important than a company B, which says that, in 5 years from now, I'm going to start saving $1. I will have a free cash flow of $1. But that $1 in 5 years, if there is an inflation of 9%, 10%, it will be equal to 50 cents or even less than that in 5 years compared to that $1 that you can get today from the company A. But not only that, Aqueel, the even bigger challenge happens when you're not even sure how big the inflation will be, right? So if you can do some cost calculation, you can at least put a value on a startup. You say, okay, we expect that you will make $1 in 5 years, and we can give you a 50 cent for that today. We can count it as 50 cent, and we can give you a value. What if you're not even sure if the inflation is going to remain at 9% year after year? What if you expect it to go up 12%, 15% in between? It may come down by 5 years, may not come down. You're not even sure what value to give that company. And that startups are going to completely get destroyed.
yeah, and that's a challenge with that discounted cash flow equation, that when you discount the future cash flow, you basically make assumptions into it, which basically are just guess. Basically, you have no idea. You basically say that this growth rate will be this. How do you know our growth rate will be 10 years from now? You say, well, inflation rate will be this. These are all assumptions, right? So we never know. But the point basically is trying to make is that that's why startups are valued at higher value than established businesses. And then he actually raised a very important question, that he said that in all this calculation, durability, nobody talks about durability. Like
Right.
whether
So
this,
so I think the way I look at it, and that's a very important point, is that when you say that our growth is gonna be 40% year over year for the next, or 50% year over year for the next 5 years, and then after that will become free cash flow positive. And a question you should ask yourself: well, will your customer stay after 5 years, or they will just move on to
yeah,
the next startup?
you will still be around. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, Kareem that started, which became Uber later on in India and Pakistan and in other countries, they were offering free rides, and they had 100% year-over-year growth, or more than 100% growth, because people were flocking to get those free rides, because they were promotional rides giving up. But the question was, how many of those customers will continue to keep taking the rides once you start charging them the full amount? And that is one of the problem that I've seen, and that he measures. He says that the problem is that if you focus on near-term growth above all else, you miss the most important question you should be asking: will this business be still around a decade from now?
Exactly.
And will it continue to have the customers? And that's one of the problem we have, is that we're over measuring growth, and we're completely ignoring the endurance or durability of a company. And
Yeah.
we're measuring it through these KPIs, a term that I completely hate, this key performance indicators or KPIs. And KPIs are just these kind of growth targets, and that's what, Kareem and others were following. And, this recent debacle in Pakistan, the Airlift, which is a grocery delivery company, and it completely went bankrupt because they couldn't raise another round. And it was because they were offering uh, completely subsidized grocery deliveries. So if somebody says that it cost me 100 rupees of fuel in 1 hour to go to a local grocery store and get groceries for me, and they're offering it to me for 10 rupees or $10, why would I want to go there? Let me just take them. But would
Yeah.
they continue to pay for it
Yeah.
when you start charging them the actual cost that you have to pay?
No, that is correct. That is correct. This is these business models are usually just created because of infusion of cash. I mean, there is no intrinsic rationale behind these business models.
So
Uh,
he goes on,
I
and
had
maybe you
another idea.
can review those. He goes on to four characteristics that he says are the characteristics of a monopoly. But if you now
But
look at this
before we move on, I
context,
I want to emphasize one point. Tanish, before we move on, the important point basically is that this basically gets to the heart of human psychology, which is that we focus too much on qualitative part of things and forget we focus too much on quantitative part of things and forget the qualitative part. Uh, they always say Peter Drucker was a very famous management guru. He actually was considered to be the founding father of business management. And Peter Drucker said, "Whatever gets measured gets managed," right? But then then the side point from that you can deduce whatever does not get measured does not get managed, right? So the qualitative things basically we ignore them. We always measure the whatever we measure, we somehow think that these are the only thing which matter. And that basically he's trying to basically focus on the qualitative part of the business. And he's basically saying that just a quantitative part of growth rate is just not enough. You have to basically say that what is the quality of it?
right? Agreed. So then, talking about quality, or talking about what makes a company more durable, which he defines as the characteristics of a monopoly. But I think if you look in this context, those are the four characteristics that define a durability of a company. Which company is going to last a decade from now or 2 decades from now, which is a startup? Why don't you go through those four characteristics?
So the first one he talks about is propriety technology. And he says that this is the most significant advantage a company has, which is to have a product which is impossible to replicate. And he basically gives an idea of what kind of product it can be. And he says that that solution has to be 10% 10 times better than the closest substitute in some important aspect, not some unimportant aspect, but some important aspect. So basically 10 times better, you escape competition. So he is actually saying that, for example, PayPal was 10 times better than sending a check. Amazon has
Right.
10 times more books than an ordinary bookstore. So 10 times, and actually this criteria is also used by Elon Musk. He also talks about the same thing. If you are
Right.
making something new, it has to be 10 times better than the existing one.
So I want to
Uh,
just quickly clarify one term here. 10 times better is sometimes also called an order of magnitude. And I think that
sure.
comes from the logarithmic scale, where the
Logarithmic
scale
scale, yeah.
jumps by 10. So 10,
Yeah.
100, 1000. So every time is 10 times more than the last
Yeah.
unit. The unit of account is increasing by a multiple of 10, and that is called an order of magnitude. Every time you jump up by an order of magnitude, two order of magnitude will be not 20
100.
times better, will be 100 times better.
No, no,
Three order of
100. Yeah.
magnitude will be 1,000 times better, because it's increasing
Yeah.
by a multiple of 10. So, and people can't think in that terms. When you say 10 times better, then two orders of magnitude will be 20 times better. No, it's 100 times better. Three order of magnitude is not 30 times better. It's 1,000 times better. 1,000 times better. So one time is
That is also,
100%.
Danish, just a side point. You know the Richter scale?
Uh-huh.
Richter scale is also logarithmic scale. So when we say that this earthquake
Yeah.
was 6,
Or
it is
7.
basically, it is 10 times more than 5, and it is
Right.
100 times more than 4.
Right.
So it is
Yeah,
also, Richter
exactly.
scale
So
is
some say,
also,
oh, it was a disaster of an earthquake. It was 7 on the Richter scale. So, well, we just saw a
yeah,
6 and it's 7. People don't realize
yeah,
that it's a 10-time increase. It's not just
it's 10
doubling
times.
of the last earthquake. It's 10 times increase of that earthquake. I think that
Yeah.
it's a side discussion, but there is a very interesting book I went through which talked about compounding. And that was also talking about this, that people cannot think in logarithmic terms. So, I'm going to give a quick example and I'm going to let people play games. So, for example, a common logarithmic thing that confuses people is rice on the chessboard. If you start with one rice grain in the first uh, space on a chessboard and keep doubling it on every space of the chessboard. I think chessboard has what, 128 spaces, 64 or 128, something like that. So if you go through 64 doubling of a rice grain, how much rice would
64,
that be?
64 spaces.
64. So how much rice that would
Yeah.
be, and people cannot comprehend that it will be more rice that can be produced on the earth. It's almost equal to the
It
grain
would
of
be 2
sand.
raised to power 64, Danish. 2 raised to power 64.
Yeah,
I think that's what it would be. 2 raised.
right. But it's the actual number of rice that is more. It's 10, 20 times more than the total rice produced on earth. Is so
Yeah.
much rice. But even better example that completely blew my mind was that if you take a piece of paper, a regular piece of paper, which usually, a 1/10 of a millimeter thick or something like that, a regular piece of a paper, something like that, and you double it, and then you double it, and you keep doubling it, and if you do 50 doubling, how thick would that paper be? And I think in 50 doubling, it will be a paper that will go from Sun to Mars or something like that. That's how thick that paper will be. And people just cannot comprehend that just doubling this paper. And I think there was even a challenge that if you take a newspaper, how many folds or how many doubling can you do on a newspaper? And I think the challenge was that nobody can do more than 8 doubling. 8 is the maximum doubling possible in a newspaper. And you can try it. This is a kid's game that people play all the time. But this logarithmic concept just completely blows up people. How complicated this concept is, this order of magnitude increase. And then my last quick comment will be that when we talk about 10 times better, it could be 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, 10 times quicker, 10 times easier, whatever that 10 time is, whatever characteristic and often people go for 10 times more efficient or 10 times more cheaper in terms of
It has to
production.
be important. It has to be important. I mean, for the customer, not some random thing which is 10 times better. It has
Right.
to be.
He
It has
does,
to be
yeah.
significant.
He does make a quick comment that the clearest way to make a 10x improvement is to invent something completely new. So just taking something and just repurposing it or scaling it or trying to increase the improvement or efficiency is the hardest job to improve 10x. The way to do it is to think of the problem and invent something completely new to solve that problem, not just improve on the existing solution. Forget on improvement. It will be very hard to create a 10x improvement on the existing solutions. And I think that's one of the problem I see. Another problem that I see in discussion very commonly is that people say, "Oh, let's not reinvent the wheel." And here Peter Thiel is saying is that no, you have to reinvent the wheel. Of course, wheel is a crazy example. Nobody's reinventing the wheel, but the point is that people often take everything as a wheel. EMR is a wheel, or calling someone is a wheel. Not everything is a wheel. So you cannot say that, oh, let's not reinvent the wheel. The whole point is that if the true innovation is reinventing concepts and reinventing solutions to the
But see,
problems.
Danish, important point here is this: when you are doing 10x of even existing problem, you are basically leaving the competition in the dust. There is no competition at that point. That's a monopoly at that again. Although you're solving maybe the same old problem, but your solution is so better than everybody else that you can't really even say that you are in competition with somebody else. On the other
Right.
hand, if let's say your solution is 25% better than existing solution, that is competition now.
Right.
That is competition now. So, but when it's 10 times better, that's no longer a competition.
Right. 10 times is 1,000% better, just if you want to compare it in percentages. So what's the
Yeah.
number two? That was number one characteristic of a durable company, a monopoly.
Yeah. Number two is he talks about network effect. So the main idea behind network effect is that product become more valuable as more people use it. And typical example is Facebook. Facebook became more and more valuable as more and more people used it, because anybody who wants to connect with people will go to Facebook, because that's where everybody else is. So basically, but for network effect, the important point is that it has to be useful to the initial users, to create that initial critical mass, which is essential to basically produce a network effect.
I think that's a
So,
hard, yeah, I think that's the hardest problem for those startups that are trying to build on network effect. If you're not building on efficiency or improvement on an existing solution to a problem, if you're trying to create a product that the whole successful business model is network effect, let's say you're trying to create a patient education forum or a doctor's forum. And the only way it's successful is that if there's a lot of doctors there or a lot of patients there. And that's your whole product. But the challenge with most of these solutions, so-called solutions, is that the only way that product is useful is to have the network to begin with. So for example, let me give you one of my challenges that we were looking at. We were trying to create a platform where we can match researchers in Pakistan with researchers in US, healthcare researchers, and to improve the research output in Pakistan. But the problem is that for that to work, you need a lot of Pakistani researchers and you need a lot of US researchers. If Pakistani researchers show up and they apply for a project and you don't have a US researcher to answer that problem, then they will leave. And then the network will start falling apart on the user side, on the customer side. But if you have a lot of advisors here who sign up and then there's no project being pushed to them, they will stop using it. And gradually they will forget their password or login or ID, or they will unsubscribe and so on and so forth. So I've tried it twice, and because everybody thinks that's a great idea. And I said, okay, let's give it a try. And it never works. It never works because it's a problem that needs the network to present on day one for it to survive.
yeah.
Otherwise, it just doesn't
This
work.
actually, Danish, this network is even more complicated than the Facebook network, because in the Facebook network, you go to the network, everybody goes to the same place to meet with other people. But in your case, you actually have two groups of people that you are trying to basically create a network with. That's even more complicated network than the Facebook network. So, yeah,
Right. So
it's
to
a big
make it
problem.
work, it will only survive if you first have something on the platform that attracts the Pakistani researchers, not for pairing, and something on the platform that attracts the US researcher, not for pairing. And now when you have both available, you say, by the way, let me also introduce A to B and B to C and C to D and so on and so forth. But you have to have those attracted first, unrelated to creating this product.
Sure.
And that's what he talks about, that for a network effect to take hold, you first have to provide usefulness to a small number of users before a network effect can happen. Let's move on. What's number
That's
three?
very important point. That's very important point, because otherwise you have to spend so much resources to basically create that network that it's just not possible. Like when it's useful to small group of people, then basically it can become self-sustaining. Small group, and it's useful.
Right.
That's the point. I
And
mean,
he even
from the
says that,
offset,
he
it's
says that often startups don't start these kind of companies because the initial network is so small, it does not look like it will bring a lot of cash flow or something like that. So, I think when LinkedIn started, for many, for like 10 years, nobody thought that LinkedIn is any useful product or something. And now LinkedIn has really taken hold, has a huge valuation, I think 40 billion or something like that. But I remember I signed up and forgot my password like 3 times on LinkedIn. And similarly, Doximity, which is a LinkedIn for healthcare professionals. I signed up for Doximity like 2 times before and keep forgetting. And now Doximity IPO'd at $12 billion or something like that. So all of these, when they look very small, you say, oh, it's not going to be anything. And that's the problem of a successful, good network startup.
Danish, it's not only true for network. I will actually propose that this is good. This is a quality of even any successful business. It has to, I would say this, it has, see, the point basically is that you can pour money on enough money. If you pour enough money on any business, you can make a business out of it. But the problem basically is that the return on that capital investment would be barely, it's just would be very minimal return.
And
right?
often the
So
durability depends on continued injection of the capital.
Sure. Let's say after at some point the company survives, right? But at that point, once the business is established, the amount of money that you have poured into it to establish it is so much that what company is making right now, it is barely justified, or it is not even justified, right? So you
ROI
can
is too
make a business.
small. Return on invested
Yeah,
capital is too small.
exactly. So the point basically is that excellent, the really good quality business, basically from a very small size, they basically generate profit, and they basically have this the bootstrap. They basically the internal mechanism of profitability built into them. It's not
A
like if we
good
have X,
business
if we
is
have Y, if we have
profitable
Z,
at a very low cost. A good business is profitable at a
very low,
very
very
low
low
cost.
cost. Good business are like a seed. A seed actually have the whole plant in it. It's just small in size. It's not requiring some extra items into it. Everything is in it. At a very small level, the whole thing is encapsulated into it.
All right,
And
let's
that's the
keep moving
quality of
on so
good
we can
business.
finish this chapter and not make this too long. So the
Sure.
third one is economies of scale, and it basically very simple. As you start offering it to more and more customer, you can offer it more cheaper. It cost you much less. And here there is a slight difference. If you are a product company, then you have to still keep making products. So although your margin is let's say 10-15%, you can make your margin slightly better. For example, car company. Initially, you have no margins because you're making such a few cars. If you start making larger amount of cars, you can buy the batteries cheap, you can buy the windows cheap and the knobs cheap, and you can start having a margin, and you can grow your margin the more cars you sell, but with a limitation, because every time when you make a car, you have to put in a capital in that product anyway. The scaling really works for a software company, a service company, or a company that does not need a physical product, where you can just keep copying the product without any extra cost, or you can just maybe need one more engineer, hardware engineer after 100,000 more customers, something like that. So the scaling is much more cheaper when you do that scaling.
Sure. Scaling works the best for software, second best for gadget-based businesses, because your fixed cost, the cost of setting up the factory and whatnot, is distributed across more number of items.
Up to a
So
limit,
that's
right?
why
So
your
if you,
cost per
for
item,
example,
of course, up to a
in
limit,
car company, let's
up
say
to a limit,
Tesla,
of course.
you made a new factory. Now that factory can produce, let's say, 500,000 cars. But now, if you need to
Sure.
scale
Yeah.
above 500,000, you need a new factory. Now you can only
Yeah.
spread it to so many products, and now you need a new factory or
Yeah.
something. It's
Yeah.
always challenging. It's a very cutthroat business. For example, Walmart or something. If you're selling so many candies, you could maybe get a 2% profit out of it. But that means that you need to sell even more to get any marginal benefit out of it. Very small margins.
Yeah, but scalability will not work in businesses like yoga studio, for example, right? Unless you basically make it like a digital or say the video screen, and
Yeah.
then it is scalable. But if a physical person is needed, then scalability will
Yeah.
not work very well for it.
And then the last one is branding, in which is basically a company has a monopoly on its own brand. And the more that brand becomes famous, for example, Apple. So any new product of Apple already will have customers lined up to buy it. Although even if it's a completely new product, if they went into a new design, a product that never existed before, they would not have a startup problem, because the startup, when it creates a new product, also have to find customers, while Apple brand will bring their customers to them. And that is what a brand value is, that it basically bootstraps your customer startup, and at least will get you initial customers. And then, of course, would you retain that customer or not will depend on the product. So even Apple has many failed products, which had a great start, but then gradually just kind of lost the steam, because brand can only get you started, but then afterwards you have only product substance will sell, and not the product itself.
Yeah, this point he emphasized a lot, that branding is, he talks about in a not a to emphasize branding, but in actually way to be careful about it, because he says that technology company cannot just be built on branding alone. You have to provide a substance. And then he gives an example of Yahoo, Marissa Mayer, who was CEO of Yahoo, who tried to basically focus on making Yahoo cool first. So her basically sequence that she focused on was to make it cool first, and then focus on products, and then traffic will come, and then they will generate revenue. So he disagrees with that model. He says that your branding basically has to be built on some substance. As a side note, when Yahoo, I think, was sold to Verizon, Marissa Mayer, I think, left with $200 million of Yahoo of stock, and then 23 million of golden parachute. So basically, Marissa
What she
Mayer
was building
herself
was her
got
own
very,
retirement money, not necessarily
exactly. So
Yahoo.
basically, yeah, she got She got quite a lot of money out of that branding and all
So
that, focusing on
yeah,
that. So
but so I'm gonna quickly add one more comment. Is that when I was reading this, and I thought that for a startup, out of these four factors, the single most important factor is the technology, proprietary technology, because network effects you cannot start with large net effects. Scaling you cannot start with scaling. Branding you cannot start with a brand. So really, what is left is the proprietary technology. Your product has to be so good that it attracts a customer. It allows you to scale. It allows you to network. It allows you to build a brand. Otherwise, it's a fail. And I think I especially bring this up because that's another problem I'm seeing is that a lot of time when we see a discussion on a startup company, they always discuss, the market, who's the customer, and how big is it, and how many you can make out of it, and how much you can sell it for. I almost never see the product get discussed in any of those pitches. Nobody shows product demos anymore. Nobody shows how good the product looks. Very few people actually show customer feedback on the product. It is almost just kind of a wishy-washy discussion on product. The product just there's a one slide
product
of
is
a picture
always
of a
like an
product
off.
and just
Yeah,
yeah.
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 Product is
It's a
like
side
some
note.
people
Product is a
always say,
side
"Oh,
note.
Google."
Yeah.
Tanish, this is the prevalent attitude now. I mean, on Twitter, I see sometimes founder talking like, "All you need is to tell a good story." That's
Yeah.
all they're talking about.
Narrative, idea and
They're
narrative
saying
and all
that
that.
building a business is about telling a story.
Yeah.
Like telling a story is good for getting venture capital money. Sure, I get that, but it won't build a business.
Right. Exactly.
So
So,
that
and then in the last section to complete this chapter quickly, and so we can close here. It's already 45 minutes or so. He talks about how you start and build a monopoly, or basically build a company that will be so good that will become a monopoly. And he says basically start small and start in a market which is relatively small where you can dominate completely. So from the get go, you're monopoly in the market that you're in, and then you scale it up gradually and scale it up into not only more of your customer but start expanding into adjacent customers from the niche or small area that you started with. Don't try to fight the existing market competitors there, or a market stalwarts, because you don't want to be on the radar, you don't want to get destroyed, and which is another problem we see, and we can talk about it. And then it may be that the first mover advantage is overrated. Basically, first mover will come in and fail, so that the next mover can come in and learn from their failure. So, try to be last in a market. Try to go to a market where there is a lot of solutions that have failed, so you can find a good solution and then really build on it.
Yeah, so basically, first he says talk about that start small, as you mentioned. So there goes your idea of TAM. Everybody's talking about TAM. So like 1% of $100 billion market. So he says that that's a bad idea. You have to start with a small market, and basically you have a small group of concentrated users with few or no competitor. So basically, that's what the market is. Big market is a bad choice. If you're starting a big market, is a bad choice. Once again, contrarian idea. This book is full of contrarian ideas. Then he says that then you scale up, you dominate that niche, and then you basically expand into adjacent markets. Like for example, Amazon. I give an example of Amazon started in book market and then basically expanding into related markets. For example, I think DVDs and CDs and whatnot.
Yeah,
And
if you
then, of
start
course, as you
Amazon
mentioned,
with
no
books,
competition.
it's very easy for you to scale into DVDs and CDs and anything that is similar.
Exactly. Yeah, but I mean, even from the shape, DVD looks like a book basically. You don't even need specialized packing for that. Even it's like same box you slip in the book and slip in the
Not even
DVD.
box,
That's how
same
it is.
paper. You can use the bubble wrap,
Yeah,
and then I think he really it's worth emphasizing this concept that he says don't disrupt. You do not
that's
want
very
to
important.
show up as a competition. If you're describing your company as something that is opposing the current setting giant, just walk away. That's a very bad idea.
He actually he says disruptors are people who look for trouble and find it. So
Right.
so basically, and in this
Yeah, I think
disruption,
it also speaks that if you are challenging an existing competitor in a market, that means you have not done anything innovative. If you're
yeah,
if you're
it means
trying
you're
to
not
snatch away
creative.
customer from somebody else, then what's the
It
innovation in
means
that? What innovative thing have you done?
it's mean you are not creative. Danish, I will actually mention the great Edwin Land, one of my favorite uh,
Polaroid.
business people. He actually said, do not undertake a project unless it is manifestly important and nearly impossible. So again, important and impossible to do. Once again, what would happen when you do something like that? No competition again. No That's it. That's the main theme in this book. Avoid competition. No competition. Do your own thing. Be 10 times
But
better
see, I mean, I
because
think
there would be no competition.
I want to make sure that, people don't misunderstand avoiding competition by saying, oh, just stay under the radar. That's not the point. The point is to do something
Yeah,
so different, so unique, so innovation, so proprietary that you have no competition. Rather than just going there or say, oh, you're
exactly.
selling this for $100, I'm going to sell it for 95, and I will compete. I'll become your
Yeah,
competitor. They can easily sell it for 95 or 94 or 93. And what's the point? So that's not how you think about a new startup. That they are selling it for
exactly.
something, and I'm going to sell it cheaper, or I'm going to make it quicker, or I'm going to get it to the customer faster. If you're just trying to give an incremental improvement to an existing solution, existing company, this is a failure to begin with. What you need is such an innovative idea that you have no competitor. Nobody else is doing it. Nobody else
Yeah,
even know how to do it, and nobody else will be able to do it in the next 10 years. Shouldn't be something. Oh, you basically went to an off the shelf engineer and said, create me something like this. Or somebody else can do it too. If it costs you 5,000 to have someone else create it for you, they can go and they can put $100,000 and 20 engineers and build something twice as better than yours. So that's another problem.
yeah.
I see that a lot of startups are basically saying that, oh, I have an idea, I'm going to go to the market, find somebody to build me something like around that idea. And if it is that easy for you to build, it will be even easier for someone else to build it who's already in the market.
Exactly.
That's a stupid idea. It's like, come
Yeah,
on.
what makes you think other can do it? What makes you think that other can do it or won't do it?
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. You say, oh, I have a
So
very innovative idea. I have this software. And then you go to, and you don't know how to create it. You basically go to someone and you say, okay, I'm going to give you $2,000. Can you make the software for me? Of course, they can make it for you. And then they will make it for the next 10 people who will also come up with the same idea like that.
exactly.
Right? Or maybe they will even sell it for them. The
And
next person wouldn't even have to think about the idea. So I made this. You want to buy it for 200?
actually, then he would be the one making all the money, actually. A software
Right,
company
by selling it to 10 other
making software
competitors
for
for
everybody.
2000 each, because he has already
Yeah, yeah,
made
yeah.
it. So he just need to copy paste it to 10 other people.
Exactly. He will be, it's the same analogy like Danish when the gold rush, people who were selling shovels were making all the money. Those who were doing the those
Yeah,
who were
doing the digging was not making money. The people who were
diggers were
selling
not
them
making any money.
livelihood, who were selling
Sellers of
them
the shovels were making the money.
shacks, how to build shacks, selling them clothes. All the grocery stores made money.
People who tell you who give you lectures about how to get rich get all the money from all their lectures. People who write the books how to get rich make all the money. People who follow those books never make any money. So there we go. uh, but anyway, the take home message, actually not take home message, the last point is, the last will be the first. So be the last mover, don't be the first mover. uh,
Right. And,
and
he also mentions, don't make it the same thing. Don't make it so easy for the next one to come and deceive you and he become the last instead of you. So you should be the last,
exactly.
meaning that nobody else can come and then copy you or replicate you or do it, one up over you. And that's exactly what we're talking about. That if you are building something that is so easier to do, then what's the point? Somebody else can do it too.
And this whole idea of survivability, like whether your business is how well it deals with competitors and survive, Warren Buffett talks a lot about with this idea of moat. And we can maybe talk about it some other day, but this is exactly the same idea, how to protect your business, because if your business is very profitable, people are going to want to come and take your business from you. That's the law of nature. So point basically that what do you
I
have
think
going
that's what
for
the
you to protect
entrepreneurship
yourself?
is, right? Entrepreneurship is trying to find those gold mines where you can go and dig and get gold. And of course, there's a lot of foolish mistakes that happen. And that's the whole point of our discussion in the books, is that to avoid those foolish mistakes. And a lot of those things look easier. Oh, I can build a next Twitter or next Facebook, or they look easier in the sense that, oh, I can just design it 5% better. I can design a better app. Well, yeah, well, whoever you will use to design a better app, somebody else can also pay him to design a better app. And that's where everybody starts making mistakes. That um, they're trying to find that rich uh, pools of capital customers, basically, right? What are we mining in business? It's customer. In the end, customer is paying you for a convenience, for a service, and you're mining them. But if these are the mistakes that people will make in trying to mine them.
Yeah. I
All
think we
right,
can end
let's
at this
stop
point.
here. This was our review of the chapter 4 and 5 of this excellent book. And we will, in the next session, start with chapter 6.